Exercising? Test, test,
Test, test, test.
test.
Test. The flu for a young child. And Thomas. Although I think Thomas was standing. Hello, everyone. This is not the official introduction slash opening of the meetup. This is the opening to the opening. I think we're gonna get started here in about, maybe 5 minutes, maybe a little more. If anyone wants to grab any drink or food prior to the commencement of the discussion portion of tonight's event, please feel free to do so. I was gonna say there's no shortage of chairs. If you need a place to sit.
Yeah, I think you've had a couple quads. Do you do that anymore? You got sweaty after the last one.
Yeah, I think once the Bitcoin Twitter folk moved on from the carnivore diet to the repeat diet, the quad became a little less fashionable. No, but I think the quad. I would recommend anyone try the quad.
4 burger patties. It's a lot of meat. 4 burger patties. Patty burgers? Which one did I say? Either one? You spend like 1 week in England and now you're just messing everything up.
That's true. It's either
Anyway.
that or the speech impediment.
Let's get started. So welcome to PubKey, everybody. This is Coinbase, part of our Bitcoin programming series. Afshin, Drew, and I started this series, which is meant to be a deep dive into, a particular topic. Mostly technical topics, but this is going to be a little bit of a deviation. We're going to talk about the strategic reserve, the Bitcoin strategic reserve that Senator Lummis introduced via bill, and President-elect Trump, soon to be President Trump, in a couple of days now, talked about in Nashville from a slightly different perspective. So he was talking about it more as a stockpile than a reserve. And we'll get into the nuance, and there's a third option that one of our guests, David Zell, will be able to walk everybody through. We're waiting on Shinobi and David Zell. Yeah, just go yell at them. But I already introduced the first two.
That's me, buddy. Appreciate
Sorry,
it.
I do it like every time. It's reflexive at this point. And do you want to introduce yourself again for everybody?
Yes, my name is Drew Armstrong. I'm a Bitcoin miner during the day, and then vaguely involved with PubKey otherwise. But it's great to have you all here today. because I think tonight's going to be a very timely, topical conversation.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Ripple a fair amount. Also, Shinobi from Bitcoin Magazine, the technical editor and writer of all things controversial, I suppose. Welcome to the stage. He may periodically stand up and turn around. That's just so he can take a sip and take his COVID mask down in order to do so without showing his mask to the camera. And David Zell, one of the founders of the Bitcoin Policy Institute, is coming up shortly. Still in the bathroom, I suppose.
Also, it's very
Yeah,
nice to
that's
see.
where the beer is.
It's nice to see Shinobi came in full combat gear, ready for tonight's discussion.
Well, thank you, comrade.
He's our resident liberal upset about Trump, so we'll get into some of that stuff as well this evening. As always, this is meant to be a tavern chat, so if somebody uses a term of art or a phrase that you don't quite fully grok, feel free to raise your hand, ask a question, interrupt. This is going to be a little bit of a Gatling gun because Shinobi's here and he talks really fast and aggressively. But we're going to have a really
All right,
good night
Tom, I'm
tonight.
going to need you to tell me which direction I have to face to drink a beer without revealing my face to the camera.
But thanks for coming, everybody. And our last panelist, David Zell, is coming up now, Bitcoin Policy Institute. Everybody, please enjoy.
Beers, that's why you were late?
Yeah, well, that's the
I love
necessary part. Next week, just so everybody knows, we have the Freedom Tech Series with the Human Rights Foundation on Wednesday, January 22nd. Followed by we have a back-to-back next week on the 23rd. It's Breeze Wallet with our Lightning Monthly is back, also brought to you by Stack. Breeze is on the 30th. Stack is on the 23rd, and then there's another Breeze event on the 30th, which are separate. You can find all the information on our Twitter and our meetup. Thanks for being here. Please enjoy.
And also, if you ever want to make sure you don't miss a meetup, you can just come here every day around 6 p.m., maybe stay till 6:30, 6:45. If there's a meetup, you won't miss it.
All right, let's kick things off. So everyone knows why we're here tonight, right? We're going to be talking about the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. If that's
Wait,
not the
I
meetup you're
thought we
planning
were-
on being for.
I thought we were here to talk about JPEGs on Bitcoin.
If we have time, sure.
What about a strategic ordinal reserve?
So what this is not going to be is it's not going to be a debate, though we have two people with completely opposite viewpoints on the utility and the implementation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. There's David Zell from the Bitcoin Policy Institute. They've actually drafted a couple of policy statements on how a SBR would be implemented. And there's Shinobi from Bitcoin Magazine, who is, I'm going to say, dead set against the idea.
So where should we begin?
All right, let's start with how the idea of an SBR first came about. When was it first proposed, discussed? David, you want to kick that off?
Yeah. I mean, the origins of the SBR date back almost to the origins of Bitcoin itself. We were talking about this like a few hours ago. There were talk forum posts as early as like 2010. At least that's the earliest one that I saw. Where, you know, somebody basically just made the shit post. They were like, the United States government has $15 trillion in debt, which is hilarious because we have a lot more debt than that now. And they were like, well, the solution is actually quite simple. We could just buy a ton of Bitcoin and then we'll have no more debt. The sort of earliest, like, sophisticated articulation of the idea, I don't want to give credit to the wrong person, but I do think it's Pierre Richard is the first person that kind of wrote something that was like more than a meme comment or post about the idea of nation-state Bitcoin adoption. But the sort of recent momentum around the idea started in Bitcoin Nashville for two reasons. One is that the president, Donald Trump, among other things, promised to create a strategic Bitcoin stockpile. Notably, that promise did not include any intent to acquire new coins, but rather to sort of nominally, like, sort of reconstitute the coins that we already have. Like, in essence, draw a new box around them and sort of, by fiat, like, call it a new thing.
Wait,
right?
what coins that we already have? Where did those coins come from? Is the government mining? Where?
No, so the United States government currently has about 200,000, little more coins. The majority of that, like the lion's share, from Bitfinex and from the Silk Road. So what Trump said in Nashville was, the U.S. Marshals are custodying these Bitcoin rather arbitrarily. Instead, the Treasury should custody these Bitcoin with this sort of strategic intent. The second reason that this idea has sort of skyrocketed, I guess, was also at Nashville. Shortly after, Wyoming Senator Lummis announced her intention to introduce a bill to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which was far more drastic than Trump's promise. Her plan mandates the federal government to acquire 1 million Bitcoin. The logic there, like talking to her staff, is that we have about 5% of the world's gold supply, so they wanted to sort of mirror that allocation vis-a-vis Bitcoin. So her bill instructs the United States government to sort of puts them on some steady state purchase schedule to buy 200,000 coins for 5 years to get to 1 million coins. And then, like we were talking about earlier, I think one of the reasons that this idea has become a lot more sort of discussed in the policy world and like outside of just the sort of like Bitcoiners on the internet is that the crypto industry writ large, like outside of just Bitcoin, super contentious, right? So, the incoming administration says we want to be pro-crypto, but that's way easier said than done. There's limited consensus, ironically, around what sort of good crypto policy looks like, and there's sort of billions of dollars on the line, depending on how sort of certain chips fall. So I think there was a lot of like frustration among policymakers, like saying, okay, you gave us all this money as an industry. Normally, industries like, competing car makers have pretty similar sort of policy asks. So like if you want to have policy that's good for an industry, that's fairly straightforward most of the time. Of course, with cryptocurrency, it's not. I think that's caused a lot of irritation and frustration among staffers in DC because they have this mandate to be pro-crypto, and then they have two groups representing the interests of crypto, giving them like mutually exclusive sort of competing visions of the good. Whereas the SBR has met, by comparison, way less resistance. And so it's like, even the sort of crypto people that are not, Bitcoin people, I think their view is, well, this probably benefits us as well. So I think those are the three reasons. That's sort of the origin of the idea, and I think those are the three reasons that it's being talked about on the eve of the origin of the idea. And I think those are the three reasons that
Is it mostly Republican sponsored, or is it bipartisan?
there are no co-sponsors to the Lummis bill. I believe that there will be probably a reintroduction of that bill in the next few months, like maybe over the summer. There are Democrats, at least one, who has expressed favorability toward the idea. That's California, Silicon Valley Congressman Ro Khanna, who spoke at the Bitcoin conference as well in Nashville. He and I actually spoke on the live desk after his fireside or whatever, and he said that he thought that the United States buying Bitcoin or owning Bitcoin was good. So no co-sponsors, even on the Republican side. But I think certainly, if we're being realistic, the momentum and sort of favorability around the idea has been, from the conservative camp. Yeah.
Although I think it is worth pointing out that there is the crypto money has not just flown, gone to Republicans. Obviously, I think was it in 2020 the largest political donor of that year was SBF, and I think most of that money went to Democrats. But that's another conversation. So I guess maybe can I jump in with a question here? So talking about the stockpile, the reserve that Cynthia Lummis has mentioned, could you maybe just outline maybe at a high level what some of the mechanisms that the U.S. government could acquire or perhaps not dispose of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that conversations around the SBR have been fraught is that it doesn't really mean anything. There are, I think for the purposes of simplicity, sort of three ways that you could have something that one might call an SBR. The first and sort of lightest touch would be that which Donald Trump proposed in Nashville. not buying or acquiring new coins, but instead sort of just mimetically like labeling them as something different, and saying that rather than sort of holding these coins as a result of happenstance, we are choosing to hold these coins that we already have for strategic reasons. The sort of middle sort of second way that an SBR could be done would be via executive order. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, which was created as sort of an offshoot of the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, kind of gives the Treasury basically a slush fund that they can use for very limited, they can invest in a sort of a limited set of vehicles to a very limited end, which is broadly the stability of the dollar. So the Exchange Stabilization Fund says that the Treasury Secretary has the unilateral authority at the direction of the President to invest in gold, foreign currencies, instruments of credit, and equities, sort of so long as it is to the end of supporting the dollar. Right now, the ESF has about $200 billion, but the net position is like closer to 40. So yeah, via an instrument of credit. So I think the financial sort of legal plumbing here is a little interesting. Like the ESF could not, at least as it is written statutorily now, just buy Bitcoin outright, but they could conceivably engage in they could sort of hit up somebody like Coinbase and create an instrument of credit wherein they are repaid really quickly in Bitcoin and just like hold them. But that fund is like far too small to get anywhere near the level of Bitcoin acquisition that Senator Lummis proposed. And that would be the third way, which would require an act of Congress. It would be a bill that would have to get passed in the House and the Senate and signed into law by the president.
And Bitcoin wouldn't be considered just a foreign currency?
N-
You couldn't make that case in sort of a legally plausible way?
I mean, maybe you could, but it'd be. I don't know why you would when you don't need to. Like, the instrument of credit stuff is not. Anything can be an instrument of credit, whereas you could sort of
including a MicroStrategy convertible note.
the MicroStrategy reserve. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding, speaking with several, is that the sort of hand waving and saying that like, oh, Bitcoin is just digital gold, so it says gold. That would probably like be met with a successful challenge in the courts. Whereas if it were done via a credit instrument, I think it would be perfectly legal.
All right, so that gives us the view from 50,000 feet of how the idea of an SBR came first from an old Bitcoin Talk forum post back in 2010 to the Nakamoto Institute and Pierre Rochard's blog post to the Trump speech in Nashville to the Lummis bill. And you just talked us through the three different paths, which is renaming the existing seized coins that the government has and calling it a reserve, acquiring coins through an executive order using the ESF, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and the third being an act of Congress, the Lummis bill. That's the groundwork. Now that we're there, why should we as Bitcoiners care or not care? Shinobi, I think that's your softball cue. Why should we be for and or against this?
Well, I mean, I think there's two reasons to be against this. Like, kind of looking at what's good for Bitcoin and like what good is this going to do the American people or government. And so to go at the first one, like this type of involvement from a superpower like the United States completely changes everything for this protocol in terms of how it worked, how people improve it, how people change it. Like, you have completely altered the calculus. It is no longer early investors and like niche nerd internet users making decisions about how to upgrade or change this protocol. It's nation states, because it has now become something on their balance sheet, something they have made a like significant geopolitical interest for them. And I think given where we are at in terms of scalability from a technological point of view, like we are woefully short of what is necessary to actually scale the use of Bitcoin in a self-custodial way that is like cost effective or affordable for your average person. And so like this combination of major nation states getting involved and now having a seat at a table as far as conversations about things like how do we improve this protocol? Like, are we going to initiate a consensus change? Like, what will that be? It is very much within like just the general collective of nation states' best interest to stop improvements like that. Because the entire threat that Bitcoin provides to them is the ability for people to opt out and exist in a parallel economic system. When that doesn't scale, when people try to do that in large numbers, that's to their benefit. And for them to get a seat at that table, especially given the role they have as a government, as the body that passes and enforces regulations, that dictates what is or is not legal, like that becomes a very tenuous situation as far as our likelihood of actually solving these scaling issues, of actually improving Bitcoin enough that a substantial enough group of people can use it in a self-custodial way to present a meaningful way to opt out, a meaningful way to apply pressure to governments. They would just go no. They would just put up roadblocks to prevent these things. And that puts the protocol in a very risky situation as far as its long-term success, not necessarily financially, but as a tool to give people sovereign access to financial rails that they can use without being stopped. And if you want to kind of respond a little bit to this before I get into the second point.
Yeah, I guess at a high level, I think the sort of look at this is helpful and good. I think where I would start would be let's just assume that everything that you said, or that Shinobi said, is true. I think how would I put this? I think the sort of flaw in that argument is assuming that it is a United States strategic Bitcoin reserve that uniquely leads to this rapid monetization in Bitcoin, or as Shinobi put it, leads to Bitcoin being viewed as a strategic asset. My view is that the sort of dichotomy is a bit false. That the sort of possible worlds are not a world in which America buys Bitcoin, or a world in which Bitcoin is not adopted by superpowers and becomes increasingly geopolitically relevant and goes up quickly in price. I think plenty of other countries could kick this off as well, and we're already seeing that at a limited scale with El Salvador, Bhutan, but also increasing interest from Middle Eastern countries like Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates. So I think the question of whether or not, again, even if we just sort of assume that everything Shinobi says is true, which is that, again, superpower adoption of Bitcoin and a sort of subsequent run-up in price is bad for the network, I don't think it's fair to say that an American SBR is the only sort of unique cause there. The reason I think that's relevant is because if you grant me that the sort of kickoff of Bitcoin's rapid monetization on a nation-state level and geopolitical relevance could be started anywhere, then you actually have sort of a different dichotomy to wrestle with, which is essentially if Bitcoin sort of starts to reach parity with gold and becomes increasingly relevant on the geopolitical stage, is it better for sort of the ends that Shinobi outlines for that to take place in a world in which America has a large Bitcoin position? Or is it better for that process to take place in a world in which America has a small Bitcoin position? My view would be that, all things equal, the former would be a much better setup for the interests of Bitcoiners globally and in the United States. So that would be sort of my first point, is just let's assume everything Shinobi says is true. I'm not sure that I buy that this policy we're talking about is the only unique instigator of that scenario. Let's see, what else did you say? I think the other point that I would make would be briefly. I know Shinobi and I are friends. We talk about this a lot, so I'm trying to. It's like we're rehashing arguments we've had over the phone. I do think that there's a fair argument to be made that the United States having a position in Bitcoin does sort of align its interests with Bitcoiners. Like ultimately, we're talking about an open protocol. We're talking about rules with no rulers. We're talking about something that anybody can buy. And while Shinobi and many of us may buy Bitcoin for its its medium of exchange sort of properties, other buyers will buy it for its store of value properties. And I'll just say here, I would be kind of heartbroken if, for all of the time and sort of effort that has been spent gaming out the super complex ways that Bitcoin could be undermined or at least neutered. Because I grant Shinobi that a world where Bitcoin is very high in price but very low in sort of revolutionary impact is not a world that is a Bitcoin success. It'd be really depressing to think that, like, after all of that gaming out, game theory, that the only thing that the state had to do to kill Bitcoin was just buy some of it. I mean, that'd be pretty sad if that is true. And then the final point that I would make here is that some of Shinobi's there's sort of a few arguments to like parse out there. I think I've addressed the sort of like raw price going up a lot and the sort of maybe resulting risk of ossification or further ossification to the protocol. But the other point that he made was that that sort of Bitcoin's strategic impact, if we kick off this nation state thing, that the United States government may sort of increasingly take the view that that Bitcoin is like not in its strategic interests, that the ability for people to make censorship-resistant transactions is bad. And the point that I would make here would be that it's a bit of a balancing act. Even if the United States government doesn't want its own citizens maybe to make transactions that it would otherwise censor, the United States government has a very strong interest in the citizens of its principal adversaries, like China, Russia, Iran, etc., to make transactions that their respective governments would otherwise censor. I would proffer that this is the reason why sort of the U.S. government created the internet and why sort of Tor came out of a DARPA sort of Navy research lab, right? Because we had this view that okay, this open protocol for the sort of transfer of communications and information presents all of these risks, but we're America. We sort of, on balance, benefit asymmetrically from a more open society relative to our adversaries. Countries like China, for example, we sort of, it's like there was that was like Reagan or whoever is head of, it was his Secretary of State, who talked about this concept of the open society, and basically his thesis was that America wins because it is just legitimately competitive in the marketplace of political economies. His view is that over the long run, open societies win and closed societies fail. In other words, we survive as a country because people want to come here. Countries like China survive, countries like Russia survive because they can keep people and, more importantly, capital in. There's the reason that you have the sort of phenomenon of the golden checkbook in China, where the government won't let you take out any material amount of money outside of the sort of Chinese economy unless you're a really privileged person and you have the sort of proverbial golden checkbook. So I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that that completely outweighs the argument that Shinobi's making, but I'd just sort of leave that as something to think about, which is that in as much as Bitcoin takes certain powers away from the United States government, when it takes those powers away from all governments globally, it's not hard to believe that on balance America benefits disproportionately the same way that it did with something like Tor.
Well, I mean, to kind of go back to the first point around risk of being unable to improve Bitcoin, I don't think it's that America is a unique trigger to bringing that situation about. I think it's the one that will bring that about fastest. And the reason I'm concerned about this is the whole concept of Bitcoin eventually ossifying and being unchangeable eventually is just posited as a consequence of its growth. The bigger it grows, the more the value increases, the more people are involved. And to actually upgrade or change the protocol in any way, you need to achieve a critical mass of, the super majority of users being convinced to adopt a certain change. And so that's just inherently, like, the larger it grows, the more difficult it is to change until it just becomes practically impossible. And while the US creating a reserve like this might not be unique in its potential to kind of get us across that, it's just not possible to change it anymore threshold. It's the one that will accomplish it the fastest, I think, when you look at different nation states' involvement or adoption or approval of anything interacting with Bitcoin. Like, we are the center of the financial world. We are the leading superpower in the world. Like, our economy, our regulations, our government set the example that half of the world follows when it comes to how they handle their legislation, their financial regulations. And so just the degree to which we will accelerate that change in terms of the rate versus other countries that could kick this off, I think we are unquestionably like the biggest influence. Like, we will instigate that fastest.
So, okay, if we're going to sort of game out that, then I think it's fair to burden you with answering the following question, or maybe two questions. One, let's just start here. How far away do you think Bitcoin is from, in your view, sort of being resistant to the negative effects you're outlining of nation-state adoption? Like, how, just generally speaking, I mean, it's sort of, it's a silly question, but I think if we're going to talk about this argument, like, the timeline does matter. So how far off, first of all, do you think we are from, protocol changes such that, Bitcoin's revolutionary potential isn't neutered even following large purchases from governments?
Well, I mean, that's not really something you can explicitly quantify, but I think some very basic covenant changes, just CTV and checksig from stack, I think would be enough to get us an order of magnitude closer to being at that point. And that might not necessarily put us over the threshold, but it will be an exponential improvement over the position that we're in now.
Do me a favor and rephrase that for anyone who hasn't heard of CTV
gonna
and
ask him
check
to
from
say
stack.
So really, really simple shorthand is a very fast, scalable way for a large number of participants to commit to money being split up between them a certain way on chain. It's very cost effective and efficient to make that commitment. And now at the end of the day, you still over time have to submit additional transactions to the blockchain and get those confirmed to claim that money, in the sense that you can spend it however you want. But once that initial cheap commitment is made in the first place, there is no way for those coins to do anything other than eventually wind up in your control. It's just a matter of how much time it takes for everybody to play out that process of getting sole control over it. And that alone, I think, just gives a massive new primitive for people to use interacting with the network. Like, right now, you want to transact cheaply. You and one other person have to go on chain and open a lightning channel, and that has to be confirmed for you to be able to spend your money. With something like CTV, hundreds of people in a single transaction could commit to, these lightning channels will eventually open, and they can use them before they actually open, because that's the only thing those coins can ever do at that point, is eventually open those lightning channels. And so just giving us a more efficient way to make your coins usable off-chain.
And of CTV, can I redline that as just saying Bitcoin covenants being added would be more helpful?
Yes.
So that when people go home, they can Google Bitcoin covenants and learn more about that?
I hope they can learn more about that, but
Great.
it might be a little confusing out there as far as resources go.
Okay,
What if they only read things you wrote for Bitcoin Magazine?
It's a start.
That's a start.
okay, so you're pretty concerned about ossification, now, though, already. And so again, I'm not trying to be like a jerk and get you to quantify.
Vacation.
Oh, right. Okay, anybody here play chess? Really, no one here plays chess?
Yes.
Not well.
Okay, a couple people do. Best analogy I could give is that chess began as this game in the 2nd century in India called chaturanga. It was similar to the current game of chess, but there were marked differences. As the game spread into Europe, thousand, in the 16. It was France and some other countries in 14, 15, 1600. These monasteries started playing chess. They started sort of changing rules substantively. They switched some of the pieces. Elephants became rooks or whatever. They added the rule of en passant. And so basically these tweaks to the rules happened. But then chess left the sort of land of bishops and priests, and people all over Europe started playing chess. Once that happened, we never really saw a rule change in chess since. So you have this period of the game from chaturanga in the 2nd century to France in the 1700s, where the rules of chess changed dramatically, and then they just never change again. In sort of Bitcoin terms, when you have, as Shinobi points out, a protocol which requires a supermajority of its users to change said protocol, the difficulty of changing that protocol and achieving consensus scales as the number of participants do, right? It's easier to get 2 people to agree on something than it is to get 2 million or 2 billion people. So ossification of the Bitcoin protocol just refers to the sort of hardening of the protocol and the sort of de facto inability to change it because of the size of its network and user base and the number of people running nodes.
All right, can you define en passant in case people don't? I'm taking this. No, I think this is very very helpful groundwork to lay. And I guess maybe just to double click on that first question you asked, Shinobi, with respect to covenants, Bitcoin covenants. Do you think say tomorrow we're able to come to some agreement around activation mechanisms for maybe CTV, and say we're somewhere between 6 to 12 months away from that being implemented into the protocol? Are you again I guess, do you now feel comfortable with U.S. Bitcoin strategic reserve or stockpile, whatever you want to call it, or is it kind of just this thing where we're not quite ready, we need to keep making changes and we need to buy whatever time we can basically, and not be an accelerant into the process?
Exactly the latter. It's just a buying time game. If the whole theory, and David kind of made the example of chess, this is something we've seen play out with anything based on social consensus. Once it's big enough, it's done. It doesn't change anymore. And if that is how Bitcoin plays out, then we need to improve it as much as humanly possible, in a safe way before we hit that point. Because whatever degree of scalability or functionality it has when we hit that point, that's it. That's all we'll ever have to build with, and we need to get that into the best place we possibly can before we hit that threshold. And it's just something like a reserve like this drastically accelerates the rate at which we're approaching that threshold.
Maybe just one other kind of question there, because for those of you guys who aren't spending every last minute on the app formerly known as Twitter, following all the Bitcoin maxi discourse, there would be some folks who would say that Bitcoin's actually a dumb money protocol, and that the less complexity the better, and that perhaps some of these recent protocol changes have been used in inadvertent ways to create things such as JPEGs in the blockchain. And so I guess some folks have said it should continue to be a dumb money protocol. Is your response to and so some would view ossification as a good thing, and maybe this accelerant's actually positive because then we'll stop tinkering around with the protocol. Is your view basically that the end of self-custody being accessible to the world and to the vast majority of Bitcoin users, that basically that is really one of the most important things, and that's why ossification, now or certainly now would be a bad thing?
Yeah, I think those people either are in a position where they believe themselves to have enough coins that they can afford to self-custody in the future, and they have a frankly like I have mine, fuck everyone else attitude, or they are just delusional in a state of cognitive dissonance and just do not understand like why Bitcoin has scaling limitations and what those limitations are. Like they just think some nerd will do some magic thing and it'll work out. And that's not how engineering problems are solved. Like you can't just snap your finger and magical thinking and everything's better. You need to embrace and work within the like physical engineering constraints a system has. And the only way to do that is accept them or change the structure of that system to be less constraining. And I think that these people are one of the two. They're either self-centered and just don't give a shit about the value they think they've secured for themselves being accessible to other people, or they just don't understand these issues at all, and they just have a wildly like naive optimism. Sorry, we got Frank.
It's okay. I'll come to the back. We'll go. You,
So this is directed at Shinobi. You can drink your beer while you hear the question. The amount of Bitcoin that you buy doesn't really give you any extra influence over the protocol. So why are you so concerned about a strategic Bitcoin reserve?
Well, it's not the amount of Bitcoin you buy alone. It's the economic influence you have as a creator of demand. Like the more the price goes up, that has an impact on miners. That will affect miners' behaviors. If action A being continued is beneficial to them and it not being continued is detrimental to them. Just the amount of coins you have in the event of contentious chain splits where people are trying to figure out which side to follow. Like dumping one side or the other can affect like the choices people make. And in the case of a government entity, could even decide to allow or not allow marketplaces like that to exist in the first place. If they're an involved actor, they can make it illegal for exchanges or businesses to even give you an open market in the first place to dump one or the other and make an open decision.
Which, to be fair, they could do in a world with or without an SBR, even granting you the first point.
But they have a much greater incentive to get involved if they are an active participant and holder themselves, like looking for specific things out of the system. And, you know, in general, it's also just like getting those players involved is like we're seeing the, you know, institutions stampeding in like post ETF. Like we are seeing the revolving doors start. Like a lot of the policy being discussed potentially under the Trump administration. A lot of this is being informed by these institutions themselves, who are now coming in the door because they are seeing this changing environment where the government is more malleable to their input if they see it as something beneficial for themselves about how to handle things. Like it's just completely changing the composition of actors involved in the network making these decisions in a very rapid way if this continues following through. And so I just think the changes in the incentives of those players and the change in the landscape itself are both very important things to think about with issues like this. Because it's not just A plus B equals C. Like the whole nature of that equation is changing as bigger players like this are getting involved.
Hello, this is for whoever thinks, has the most experience with this. So I understand why we need to, the U.S. needs to hold inventory, to control a certain amount of Bitcoin. But isn't there like a bigger picture or bigger factors in place when it comes to like Bitcoin's lifeline, like energy distribution, miners or compute power, and the actual hash rate distribution, right? Right now, I think it's Foundry and Bitmain which control a majority of the hash rate, the pool. So we have U.S., which is Foundry, and then we have Bitmain, which is China. So those three factors is that like more important for the lifeline of Bitcoin than just, let's just control inventory or let's hold inventory?
You want to go first on that one?
Well, like just the stepping stone of holding that inventory and holding it is just like naturally setting up like being concerned or getting involved with the mining ecosystem, and like we've already kind of started to see things like that. Like Taiwan, I believe it was Bitmain, although don't quote me. I don't follow the mining space too deeply these days. Got cut off or kind of sanctioned by TSMC, the chip fab company, because they were using their relationship with TSMC to get chips fabbed for Huawei, which TSMC doesn't interact with due to U.S. Sanctions and restrictions on what can be exported to China. And that's a factor going on right now. And I've seen numerous stories since that happened of shipments of Bitmain equipment actually being stalled or seized coming into the country through customs. So like we're already in the same vein, the ETFs and the market dynamics have become huge factors. We're starting to see have an impact. Like governments are starting to take actions like that, looking specifically at the mining area of the ecosystem as well.
Although maybe just to add a couple points on, because I think what you've said, especially around the TSMC potentially restraining Bitmain supply, or they're potentially being them being shut off in some way from the ASIC production that they want, I think is a very good one. But maybe just to add a couple other points. So a lot of the miners being stuck in U.S. customs, this stuff has happened in the past. But I think in general, customs have become a little more wary of potential shipments coming from China or China-related entities over the last year in particular. But miners have had like things get stuck in customs and held up in customs. I can say firsthand back in 2022, my own company had customs basically say like, hey, we need some more proof that these miners are coming from where they say they're coming from. And customs is sort of if customs is doing something that you think is wrong or inappropriate, really the only way you can go after them is just to sue them in court. And it's sort of like good luck with that. It's like quite a high burden of proof. And so in the meantime, there's really not much you can do with customs. But I think that's a great point. And maybe just to return to your the pool question, the TLDR is that switching costs from different pools are so low that if a pool did start to do something nefarious, then miners would switch. Now, that's sort of like maybe a cop-out of an answer, but sort of we've seen the majority of network hash rate be controlled by the same entity a few times, and there basically has been two different Bitmain pools that are both amount to over 50%, and it kind of, like it at the time it did not seem to be censoring any transactions offhand. Of course, this is always a risk, but this is why hardware manufacturing decentralization is good, pool decentralization is good. Shinobi.
To touch on the pool dynamic, like that is a very different landscape even today. I mean, like technically, like from a technological point of view, the switching cost is almost non-existent. But that has completely changed for public companies as far as like legality and regulations. Like a private miner can switch pools like that, but a big public company like Riot or other pubcos, they are legally mandated as a public company to meet the requirements for like different accounting regulations like SOX compliance. And so they legally, even though technically they could throw the switch, are only allowed to mine with pools who offer services that are compliant like that from an accounting regulatory point of view.
Well, so yeah, interestingly, like the exact mechanism there is that like you need to be audited to be a public company, and the auditors will not sign off unless there are certain things that they can get comfortable with. And so that's like a weird aspect of like perverse soft power being played out, where it's like not illegal for you to use like, whatever pool you want, insert whatever pool you want, like use a Chinese pool, anything like that. But from a practical standpoint, if you have a 30-day or a 90-day window after the annual financials end where you need to publish your audited financials, then you basically are just like constrained. And the U.S. government could just lean on the auditors and be like, hey, you actually need to do this, or you need to make sure that there's this specification in the pool in order to get the audit, et cetera, et cetera. But it's another great point. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, we touched on it already, but the importance of understanding what the economic nodes are, the nodes that are going to be controlling a lot of the flows for the ETFs, what the U.S. government's holding, all of that kind of stuff. But I was also kind of curious your opinion on all this. I know you're not necessarily part of, please. As someone who works on the protocol, your thoughts on all this, what worries you, what direction should we head in?
Talked about this during the spaces. Usually Coinbase is a deep dive on the technical issues, and this is pretty far from being a technical issue. It's political. So I hate to answer a question with a question, but I'm going to turn this into a question for Shinobi. Not to relitigate the block size war, but we've seen in the past, we've got exactly one instance of actors in the Bitcoin protocol trying to block changes to the protocol. SegWit and SegWit2x back in 2014 through 2017. It wasn't a nation-state actor, but it was the largest exchange, Coinbase, one of the largest economic nodes, one of the largest investors, Roger Ver, the largest manufacturer of ASICs, Bitmain, all lined up against making a change to the protocol. We saw how that played out. Obviously, the change went through. How would it be different with a nation-state actor?
Well, I think that mostly comes down to, to start, like what defines Bitcoin? Like, what actually decides what the rules are and, like, what the limitations are? It's just the software that each person runs. Like, when you receive a Bitcoin transaction and you run the official Bitcoin core software, like, that piece of software is downloading and verifying every single Bitcoin transaction ever made on the blockchain and making sure that every single transaction that's ever occurred follows every rule that that piece of software enforces. And so the only reason that Bitcoin as a coherent, like, singular thing even exists in the first place is because everybody chooses to run software that enforces the same rules. Like, I could very easily take my software, change it to enforce different rules, and then when some transaction is made that violates the rules I'm enforcing, but nobody else, then I essentially am now on a different blockchain that from the point of that transaction diverges from everyone else. And the reason that Bitcoin exists as a useful thing is, like, all of you are running the same rules. I'm just the random asshole who's like, no, I'm changing it. And you all just ignored me and kept running the software that you already were. So, like, that's what makes this work. And so what everyone's talking about with economic nodes is, like, when you receive transactions yourself and verify them yourself, like, you are an actor in the economy. So if you sell a shit ton of whatever product or service that you provide all the time, like, people trying to buy that from you have to give you Bitcoin in a transaction that follows the rules you enforce. Otherwise, when they try to send you money following some different rules, you're just going to go like, no, you didn't actually send me the money I wanted, so I'm not going to give you what you're trying to buy. And it's just everybody being on the same page enforces that, like, decides what the rules of this are. And so when you start having an actor in that system who is not only, like, enforcing the rules themselves when they receive money in that system, but they have the power of law. They have the power of the police to enforce things. Like, it's not just them going, I'm going to change the rules and you can all just ignore me and keep doing what you're doing, because I can also go pass a law that says you have to run these rules that I want to change things to. Or if you want to turn this into a battle in the marketplace of who can dump the other person's coins to a lower price and get everyone to come and use yours, well, I'm going to pass a law that says you're not allowed to have that marketplace. Only my coin can be traded in the marketplace and have a price established. So when you have state get involved, like, there is a lot more ways they can influence those situations beyond just, I'm going to make my choice, and if you interact with me, you have to, like, respect my choice. I can coerce you into making the same choice that I do.
Okay, so that's the difference. The nation-state actors have a greater ability to make coercive changes because they have access to laws to men with guns to the money printer.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess my sort of like quip or response to that would be that, again, like outside of dumping coins that they buy in the hypothetical SBR scenario, none of those other things are unique to a world with a strategic Bitcoin reserve. If the geopolitical relevance of Bitcoin continues apace, and Shinobi is correct, then the government has an increasing interest in sort of protocol changes. Then I guess my view would be that I just don't buy that the state, absent a large supply of Bitcoin, is sort of lacking in ways to interfere with users, with Bitcoin, in general. Like, again, I sort of just think that for all of the reasons that Shinobi said, that we live in meat space, and there's a monopoly on violence, etc. So, and I think that there are ways that the United States government, again, if it wanted to, could easily try to influence the outcome of debates about the protocol, even without a markedly larger amount of coins to sell.
There is also perhaps another question of government competence, and I guess there are different parts of the government, but one wonders if Bitcoin, if the U.S., is the SEC going to be digging into the talking about which protocol rules maybe should or not be changed? I think there are probably some government-related entities that maybe would be much more sophisticated and have maybe some alternative means of being involved, but perhaps they already are involved.
Yes, this people like to pretend the government is incompetent. The politicians may be, but the bureaucrats are absolutely not. I could go dig up reports from intelligence agencies back in 2014, 2015, presciently predicting how Bitcoin would influence markets and politics if it continued to grow, the risks that it would present for sanctions evasions, for propping up criminal markets like black markets, human trafficking, and the four horsemen of the internet type thing. And even just, a demonstrable, actionable plan to attack the system. MIT in 2015 or 16 spelled out a program called Chain Anchor, which is actually a brilliant system. That demonstrates a deep understanding of the incentives of Bitcoin to essentially hijack the network. And the TLDR of the idea is, if you as a Bitcoin user will voluntarily associate KYC data with every transaction you make, they will bribe miners to confirm your transactions faster than ones that don't do this. And the whole idea was to try to subsidize miners participating in this until they grow to be a majority of miners, and then pay those miners to actually orphan any block out of the blockchain that contained any transaction without this KYC data, so that it would be impossible to get your transaction confirmed without KYCing and making everything you do surveillable. And this was almost 10 years ago now. The government was recognizing the incentive structure of how mining worked and laying out a plan to subvert that against it.
But what about the Vasculian idea of transaction fees as a means of censorship resistance? And that, as long as there is a mine, I guess really what you're saying is once you get above the 51% threshold, then it's game over. But until that, you maybe have a counterweight on those subsidies. But then again, I guess if you own the money printer and you own the biggest money printer in the world, theoretically these subsidies might be limitless in the short term.
Yeah, and frankly, just to not shy away from talking shit in public, flip a coin. Eric either makes a very on-point logical observation, or he says the most retarded shit I've ever heard in my life. He opens his mouth, flip the coin.
And you can play the game yourself by buying Eric Voskuil's Crypto Economics, available on Amazon for the everyday low price of $30-odd.
Nobody's take on that before I actually try tackling your question. So first, the first thing that came to mind when you brought it up was it triggered the memory I had of back in 2010 when WikiLeaks first started accepting Bitcoin donations. And Satoshi, everyone was celebrating on the Bitcoin Talk Forum message thread that announced it. except Satoshi, who said, "Whoa, this is a terrible idea." And I think it's been a while. Let me see if I can dig up the exact quote from my memory.
wanna stay
WikiLeaks has
under
kicked the hornet nests, and now it's coming for us. And that was 14 years ago. I don't think anything has changed. I think the more power, whether you define that as money, whether you define that as the ability to deploy ASICs, whether you define that as access to the legal system, the more powerful actors that join the Bitcoin network and become part of the Bitcoin network, the more us less powerful actors are, I don't want to say at risk or at their mercy, but the equilibrium changes for us. I don't necessarily believe that there's any soft fork in the offing that would make me feel comfortable. If a nation-state actor kicked off an arms race starting tomorrow, I wouldn't say, "Oh wow, well we have covenants. I'm less scared now."
There's nothing that makes it a guarantee, at least as far as proposals that are concretely defined right now, just gives us better odds.
So instead of placing my faith in any one soft fork, why don't I ask, let's pretend an SBR is announced. What's inauguration day? Tuesday? Monday? All right, it's Tuesday, day one, we get an SBR. What would you be doing as a Bitcoiner? What would you recommend other people do?
Reselling?
No. I
Dump
never
everything.
will.
We're going Bitcoin Cash.
I never will. There
Dogecoin.
are so many future timelines in which Bitcoin is worth a shitload of money and is still completely captured. But it's time to turn on CTV and a few other basic covenants if we get to that point. And I know that a lot of non-technical Bitcoiners are very skeptical and worried about changes or upgrades, even some that have kind of been proposed for a long time. But it's a simple reality. If we do not improve and upgrade this protocol, it will be captured. And if you deny that, I'm sorry. You live in a state of delusion and an unwillingness to accept the limits of your understanding of things. And like that fear, if that completely stalls out improving this protocol while we still have a chance to, then this has all failed. And it doesn't matter whether the price is $1 million or $0 after that, it's failed. Like, people might get rich, but this will do nothing to make the world a better place.
SBR is announced on Tuesday. That's your move. You're going to be trying to, with renewed vim and vigor, push forward with some sort of covenant activation.
Yeah.
Well, we have 4 or 5 days. We still have time. We can get covenants activated by then. You think? 4 or 5 days. We still have time. We can get covenants.
Sorry, lean in. Is her mic on?
About we were talking about the SPR. Oh, okay. I hate this. The question regarding the SPR. So, with that, you talked about how the government is already in possession. A lot of this has now been in possession during this current administration, and this currency will be transferred over into the new administration. But moving forward, how do they plan on supplying the SPR? I mean, if they're going to be acquiring Bitcoin, then it has to be purchased. So in that in alone would create an inflationary environment because we'd have to print more fiat. So how
I
does
think
this
there's
come
3
about?
answers to that question because there's 3 different paths to an SBR, so you're going to have to give her
I was going to say, I feel like there are a few things to sort of like address there. The first is that it's not that the coins are being transferred to the new administration. It's just that we have coins, and like the sort of lowest lift proposal for an SBR doesn't involve acquiring coins. It's just saying we're not going to sell the coins that we already have. So that's like one version of the SBR that Trump proposed in Nashville. The second point is like, is an SBR inherently inflationary? And the answer to that is it depends. If the government were to just like, print debt and engage in deficit spending to finance the acquisition of Bitcoin, that would certainly be inflationary. if you look at Lummis's proposal, the mechanism by which she recommends America, or not recommends, but the mechanism by which America buys Bitcoin in her bill is that we remonetize the existing gold certificates that we already have and then use the proceeds from that. Like, we have gold certificates, basically, that are not marked to market. So she basically says, well, we mark these certificates to market, we sort of get this paper gain of money and wealth, and it's essentially selling gold to buy Bitcoin is like her proposal. Whether or not that is inflationary, I am not like an economist, and I'm not going to pretend to like give a good answer to that. I will say that George Selgin, who Satoshi was, a reader of and a well-known economist, is certainly critical of Lummis's proposal to do this.
As a gold bug himself.
Yeah, he has we were talking about this upstairs as well. He has a book, like a really short pamphlet that's published by Cato, called The Menace of Fiscal QE. And so Selgin's take would be that, I guess like Lummis's argument would be, this doesn't sort of change anything. We're not like spending, new money. We're just taking gold and we're trading it for Bitcoin. Selgin's argument, as best I understand it, would be, well, this is essentially just fiscal quantitative easing, because in particular, you can't just pretend like the only two options are gold or Bitcoin, right? If we're going to sell gold, we could use it to keep the Social Security Ponzi scheme going longer, or like any number of like things. The other option via the ESF, that certainly wouldn't be inflationary. Like the ESF's net position is they're in these like sort of like IMF drawing right, like it's like these sort of international investment vehicles, like basically just like global bonds and like drawing rights on commodities. So it would really be more like a portfolio rebalance. And I don't think Selgin's argument applies to a purchase from the Exchange Stabilization Fund, because unlike gold, where it's like, okay, if we just make money, we can spend it on whatever we want. It's not like the Exchange Stabilization Fund can legally do anything other than make sort of random investments in things to the end of supporting like the dollar. So it's not like we could exit these like random like IMF investment vehicles and then turn around and do a UBI or like invest in Social Security or whatever.
Trading naked shares. Okay. They're just moving naked shares between different entities. And if you're trading naked shares, okay, a lot of people in the space vote specifically for Trump because of them being of the Republican Party being pro-Trump. So my concern is, it sounds very broad-based. Nobody really has an answer of how it's going to be done. So are we really sure that when it is done, it's going to be done correctly? Or it seems to be like, well, there's gold, and we can sell gold, and we can get Bitcoin, and we can get another coin as long as we have coins in reserve. It's so open-ended. I really have a problem with anybody.
Well,
Yeah.
I would say the correct way to do it would be don't.
Although I think we might already be on an inflationary trajectory as it stands. But I think, to your point, we don't know the exact answer, but depending on the different mechanisms, we can maybe try to reason our way to the likely outcome. I mean, it would be crazy if the U.S. government just smash buys on Coinbase the million Bitcoin they need. We may finally see Odell's supply squeeze of on exchange Bitcoin. But I think also your point around the Lummis idea of selling the gold certificates, it reminds me of Bitcoin Tina's old prophecy, God rest his soul. Gold holders will be brutalized by Bitcoin. And it would be hilarious if the U.S. government did basically a short gold, long Bitcoin pair.
Yeah, well, I guess my sort of response to that would be, if it is done via an act of Congress, then we won't have to speculate before we decide whether we're for or against it, because that process will take place like out in the open. Like Lummis will probably reintroduce a version of the bill, and then we're like a slow sort of American democracy, so there is like time to influence the text of her bill. So if she releases this, and I think most sort of politicians, I'm not going to say you can change the world by calling your local congressperson or whatever, but I do think Lummis has, spent a lot of time trying to work with Bitcoiners, and her office is certainly super receptive to critique. And they spent a lot of time in the first few weeks after Nashville just sort of fielding counter arguments, complaints, criticisms, etc., which is why they're intending to release an amended version of that bill. So I know it's not an answer to your question, but I guess what I would say is that if she reintroduces her bill and you have issues with it, it's not that hard to get on the phone with her or her staff as a Bitcoiner. And so I think that in that scenario, there will be a policy debate, and it will take place largely in public. To your point on the executive order potential, frankly, that is a bit more of a black box. Trump is the president, and the president has unilateral authority across a ton of domains, and so he has no requirement to engage or solicit feedback from the public. You would expect that to happen, but in some respects, often when presidents do sort of more drastic executive orders, they start on more of a slow burn. Kind of like what Biden did with crypto a couple of years ago. It was the inverse, where he had the executive order set that tasked all of these agencies with writing these reports about why Bitcoin was going to boil the oceans and why crypto was going to help, the sort of four horsemen thing that Shinobi talked about. But to your point, it's not at all a guarantee that any executive order is subject to strict scrutiny by the public. It is just a sort of fact of the political world that, the sort of structure of government that we live in, that the president can just, write something and sign it as an executive order, and then, it's an executive order. I guess the flip side to that is, of course, that they're very ephemeral and they don't really have the standing or the full force of law the same way a bill does. A lot of what a president seems to do these days, the number of executive orders that presidents sign has gone up parabolic. It's almost like the Bitcoin price over the past 40, 50 years. So it's customary now for presidents to issue thousands of executive orders over the course of their term. And then a large part of what the next president often does, if they're of the other party, is just sign a bunch of executive orders to undo the previous person's executive orders. So I don't exactly know how to answer your question, but that would just be my sort of take, is in a bill form, you can, as a citizen, as an American, weigh in, and, there will be a public debate. And you are correct that in the sense that the president could sign an executive order to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve where the general public would have no such opportunity. That's just true.
So a question about something totally different, security budget. So would you, from an adversarial standpoint of a potential actor that wants to take over 51% of the hash rate, so all transactions can be censored, or I can just cause a loss of faith in the coin and tank it. It seems like that incentive would increase as more nation states adopt it and as it becomes more of a central monetary thing. Sort of, you can think of it right now, if you could just invest $40 billion and cause all the gold in all the vaults around the world to not be able to be moved, is that a good bet or not, depending on what type of actor you are? But it seems like there's a similar case for Bitcoin reserves.
Well, I don't really see how the reserves factor into that, but there are two things I would say. First of all, you have to be able to source the hardware to run that in the first place. And right now, that's a very centralized thing. As far as cutting edge fabs at 3 nanometers, the only 2 fabs I'm aware of actually producing ASICs are Taiwan, TSMC, and then Samsung in South Korea. Those are your only options to really have cutting-edge competitive machines.
So could I just interrupt really quick?
Yeah.
So, yes, it would cost a lot of money, but as the value of the world Bitcoin supply goes up, then it becomes more like the EV on that is better. It becomes more rationalized to spend that amount of money. Like
But
if
it's not just a factor of the money. It's about the throughput of those fabrication plants, and also like what else are they doing? Like those same fabs produce the chips used to manufacture Samsung phones or
So-
iPhones, and so in order to ramp up your production of Bitcoin ASICs to acquire enough hardware to attack the network, you are going to have to compete or displace
Yes.
all of that production line for those
yeah,
major
you'd have to spend a
economic
lot of money. It would be an investment to build your own fabrication or whatever it is. But if like the stakes are so high, like if you could invest $50 billion right now to wipe out $100 trillion of gold in the world, depending on who you are, that might be a good thing to do. Like if you have very little gold and your enemies have a lot of gold, you might invest $50 billion to do it, maybe. But
see,
there is
thing
some
though,
price where you
it's
can
Samsung and TSMC that you have to convince to, and it's not just I have the money, it's I have the money to make up for all of the lost revenue from displacing Samsung productions, which is their own devices they're producing or iPhone devices, and the opportunity cost of those companies now as constant consumers, maybe looking elsewhere or investing in capacity themselves, and no longer giving you business because TSMC and Samsung decided to turn them away.
You're kind of saying I couldn't build a certain amount of cars because all the cars being built by Ford and Toyota or whatever are going to consumers. I could build my own car factory.
This is not just money though. Like the manufacturing processes TMC uses or TSMC uses are proprietary and secret. And they're actually now kind of internally getting into a huge political debate about what equipment should or should not be exported from Taiwan to the fab facilities that they're opening in the United States.
I was going to say, I mean, like America, I think presently has a far greater incentive to replicate TSMC just with the current like incentives at play than it does, you know, in some world where Bitcoin becomes like more valuable. Like if we basically have infinite money to a degree, right? Like we just print it. If this were simply an economic problem, I think America would we would have replicated TSMC by now. I don't think even like a 10x, you know, or a 20x in the price of Bitcoin would sort of come close to the present incentive that
But
we have.
to flesh it out, I think would effectively one key piece is would not necessarily need to be brand new machines. It would not necessarily need to make cutting edge machines. I think the point here is more so that there is and I just did the math. So right now a network hash rate is 800 exahash. If you take the current most efficient machines are being traded for like $18 a T. So even if you assume that the entire network is the most efficient model, that's only like $14 billion, which is, so I think there's a case to be made where maybe the same argument holds buying on the secondary. If the government just bought a ton of, enough S19J Pros or some arbitrary amount of equipment. Now, of course, then we get into order book dynamics, how much incremental, like indiscriminate buy pressure.
Let's just say that we'll get rid of all those dynamics. You have the hardware. Now, where are you getting the energy?
Well, actually, so really what you would do,
But I don't mean to be dismissive, but we just went through this exercise when the Chinese shut down hash power. A whole bunch of people had money burning holes in their pockets. They got their hands on ASICs. It's a lot harder to find $14 billion worth of electricity.
But again, potentially,
if you have a gigawatt nuclear reactor in your back pocket,
or if you have a 22 gigawatt hydroelectric dam in Sichuan. But I hear what you're saying. I think what you guys are both making, I think everyone's making excellent points. But I do think there are other ways for, say, like a government to accumulate hash rate, and I think basically the critique does hold that, someone could potentially try to amass this much hash rate. But again, the big counter to that, to the point, is it's the beautiful thing about it being proof of work, like proof of energy consumption, is that you hope that the real world friction is the security and is the defense for pulling off an attack such as that. But you're right, in principle, a government might be incentivized to spend an arbitrarily large amount of dollars to try to amass that hash rate, but to try to make Bitcoin worthless. But again, Bitcoin security lies in the real world infrastructure that is supporting it, and it's sufficiently difficult to co-opt. This for sure. Yeah.
But see, that doesn't work like that necessarily because the price of Bitcoin might go up. That doesn't magically make the energy available go up. And really, the only thing that matters for the network to be secure is that honest miners are consuming more than half of the available or cost-effective energy they can get. Like you could have the amount being secured or being spent to secure the network be $100 billion a year and Bitcoin worth $50 trillion. But if that $100 billion a year is enough to buy most of the available energy on the market, and honest miners are the ones consuming it, then the network is secure. And it doesn't matter that 100 billion is a tiny fraction of 50 trillion because you still need the energy at the end of the day. Like, that's the thing that matters.
Although, but what about quantum computers?
Well, my,
sorry.
I would have like one more sort of response to your question, which would basically be the dynamic that you laid out at the very end of your question. Like when you were giving the example of gold, you created a hypothetical scenario where the United States, or say actor A, is incentivized to spend $40 billion to wipe out, whatever you said, 100 billion, whatever it was, $200 trillion worth of, $14 trillion worth of gold. No, the gold market cap is 14 trillion. So in your scenario that you said, like, to you, the logical scenario for spending a ton of money to wipe out $14 trillion of gold, you said in a world where we had very little gold and our adversaries had like a lot of it. Yes. Right, and you said that the sort of actor which has that incentive would likely be an actor which, relative to its peers, has less gold. That's sort of my whole argument, is that like, if America has more Bitcoin relative to its adversaries, we're less incentivized to sort of do that. No, I understand.
But I think this is another maybe example that goes to show like Bitcoin, the security is not like absolute. But again, it's sort of about the incentives of the system, and it's sort of the way it's designed is such that as long as you have 51% of honest nodes, or sorry, honest, economic nodes, honest miners, then the system should be immune from such an attack. But that again, it's not sort of like we're not dealing with absolutes here, where like it will always be secure. It's just probabilities might shift, and it's similar to the security budget in general, where it's like, do we have enough of a security budget? Again, it's sort of it's an impossible question to answer in a way, because it's like it seems secure enough right now where there hasn't been a 51% attack, but again, it's sort of it's an impossible question to answer in a way. In fact, it could.
Thanks for the discussion, guys. I was wondering if Shinobi could explain why he thought the strategic Bitcoin reserve would be bad for Americans or America.
Well, I don't think it's actively bad, but thank you for remembering that I did have a second part that we never got around to addressing. I just don't think it does much good. Like what's the market cap right now at around 100K? Like 2 or 3 trillion of Bitcoin? 2 trillion? Yeah. Okay.
Only
so
2?
Let's say we got 1 million Bitcoin. We 10x. That's 100,000 times 1,000,000, whatever that is. I suck at doing math in my head. But $2 trillion, 10x, $20 trillion. Okay. What do you think our debt's going to be by the time Bitcoin's worth $1 million? Like, let's say we buy a whole 1,000,000 Bitcoin reserve. We have our debt growing the entire time. Like, you can't even in that crazy bullish scenario pay off our debt.
No, I mean, the craziest thing about it is that if we get 1 million Bitcoin, it's not a 10x. Like, this is we're talking like, many orders of magnitude, I think.
But no, think about it. We have to, like, in order for that to have any chance at making even a sizable dent in our deficit, you have to have us successfully get our hands on 1 million Bitcoin, like around this price level, and then have
nationalized
it 10x and go to $1 million at least, to just be able to take all of our reserves and be Bitcoin broke again, to not even finish paying off our debt. like the deficit we add every year, like the infrastructure spending that we need to do. It's like no matter how much Bitcoin we get, like in the most ridiculously bullish scenario, like what good is it going to do the American people to stockpile this massive amount of Bitcoin rather than just directly take the money we would use to do that to like slash our budget to build this infrastructure? Like it's not going to have this crazy beneficial like impact for the American people. It might have a positive one. It might do some good, but it's not this world-changing thing. Like even in the most absurdly bullish scenario, it just improves our situation marginally.
Well, I know you don't like mean this, but the way that you responded to Zach's comment is, I think, it's sort of basically saying if the strategic Bitcoin reserve can do nothing to shore up America's debt problem, then it cannot drive benefit to like Americans. And I feel like that's just certainly not true. It can both be the case that you can concede that a strategic Bitcoin reserve, even in a wildly bullish scenario, would not make a dent or may not make a dent in our debt, and also still believe that America buying Bitcoin is good for America.
Well,
I think there's a whole
well,
host of. If you're going to assume the sort of actorhood of the states, I think there's a whole host of reasons an SPR would be good that don't involve the deficit at all.
I think it would be better for Americans to just print money and replace our infrastructure, build things we need to actually sustainably take our own natural resources to take care of our own needs.
To build back better.
Build that up, and then just tell the world, well, kiss my ass, we're defaulting. I think that would be more beneficial for most Americans than trying to scramble to build a huge stockpile of Bitcoin.
Well, I guess just maybe to, in a way though, I think you took what Shinobi was saying quite literally. I think another interpretation is that Shinobi's kind of saying, given the debt profile, it's like so over for the U.S. government to like fix this debt problem. So we don't need to risk breaking Bitcoin to try to like help the U.S. government when it's so over because of the debt. Which I like. I mean, you can certainly see a logic to it.
So going back to the previous person who was asking about the 51% attack, I just don't buy your argument, Shinobi, about this being constrained by manufacturing of chips. Like, what protects us from the government just nationalizing all mining infrastructure that's already inside our borders?
I think that only amounts to around like 30 to 40% right now of network hash rate. I need someone who actually reads all the press releases to say that for sure. But like at last I checked, PubCo miners only own around 30% of the network hash rate. And so even if they did nationalize all of that, and then let's say they also were able to like, nationalize a couple other countries worth of miners, I think it still would be difficult to pull that off.
And even then, like states, like Texas is the biggest concentration of hash rate in the U.S. Like if the U.S. federal government tried to just mass seize property like that, Texas would tell the Fed to go fuck themselves. Like that's not just they say it and so it'll be done.
Before I hand the mic to the next question, I will note when we were talking about the spaces earlier on Twitter, we did talk about the idea of the equivalent of like a Plaza Accord or Bretton Woods 3.0, where multiple nation states collaborated to get on the same page and collectively have 51% of hash power. So we talked about what happened if one nation nationalized mining, but if multiple nation states collaborate to get their hands on 51% hash power, I think that's a different topic.
You probably could do that if you got the U.S., China, and Russia all to get together. I think you could probably get to 51%.
Yeah, so I'm fairly new at all this, so it's probably a rudimentary question. It's kind of piggybacking off the other question there as well. So what's stopping the government from creating a bunch of virtual nodes on one of these cloud providers and then just essentially running node validators that run different software, right? So that have like a different baked-in subsidy block reward every time a miner actually does it. Doesn't that like undermine the integrity of the system?
No, that would have like no meaningful effect on anything. To explain why, I guess I would try to use this as an analogy. Like imagine if like this mass movement of people just started counterfeiting like blatantly obviously fake $100 bills and started all in like the thousands trying to spend them all throughout the city here. Like it doesn't matter how many fake bills they make, how many people are trying to spend them, like every business you go into is just going to go, that's not money, get out of here. Like no matter how overwhelming like the group of people doing that is. Every business you go into is just going to go, that's not money, get out of here. Well, it follows the longest valid block. And so like when that comes down to like you, let's say you're one of these businesses here and you are running like the real Bitcoin software. Like it's the same thing as like the counterfeit cash analogy. Like it doesn't matter how many people come with this fake money trying to spend it with you. The second they hand it to you, you are going to see it's fake. And so you'll refuse to give whatever they're trying to buy to them. And so like the real economy will just ignore like all of those fake notes like that.
Hey, I just wanted to chime in. Shinobi, I appreciated your point about infrastructure. I think that's a really critical problem for this country. And I guess I wanted to try to tie that together with the Bitcoin on the balance sheet of the federal government as a solution. By invoking the concept of Triffin's dilemma, which many are probably familiar with, the idea that when your currency is your greatest export, it strengthens dramatically, and so you're incentivized to move your manufacturing base to other countries, right? And that's essentially, that was predicted at Bretton Woods, if I recall the history correctly. So that coupled with the $37 trillion of debt, and then you have the interest payment is like the largest percentage of the federal budget, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a ticking time bomb. So I think it's essentially, and I'm kind of invoking the work of Luke Groman, who's a really, I would say, intelligent thinker on this issue, that it's like, quote unquote, just math, that it's going to be done, and then you think about sort of the game theory from like the nation state perspective as well. So my thought is, I think it has to get done. And so we might as well just go ahead and get on with it. I think we're all maybe a little overexcited because it's like, oh my God, Trump is going to pump our bags, to like, to Kingdom Come or whatever. But I do think it's inevitable, right, for all of those different reasons. And I just wanted to frame it in those concepts. It's maybe not so much a question. I apologize for that. But I just wanted to invoke those concepts. I thought that might be helpful for the thinking here.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I think at the end of the day, it's, it's done. Like there is no way, like Lynn Alden loves to say, like there's no stopping this train. And like why try to delude ourselves that a massive stockpile of Bitcoin will do that? Like what would you rather have, like as a nation? Would you rather have your government have this stockpile of hard money that's in no way enough to balance the budget, no way enough to fund things sustainably, or would you rather them just say fuck it and turn on the money printer and build the infrastructure we need to take advantage of our natural resources? Like, yes, like having dollars and being able to export our inflation is hugely beneficial, but we're still like one of the largest countries in the world in terms of natural resources that people need. Like energy, oil, food, like arable land, like livestock, like China. Like they're totally dependent on us for beef to meet like the protein needs of their population. Like even if the dollar implodes, like we default on our debt, we deal with all the consequences of this, like we still have all of the natural resources in this country. So would you rather have a stack of Bitcoin that doesn't do anything to fix the situation that we're in, the problems we have, or just go on a spending frenzy to build the infrastructure we need to continue like actually making use of our natural resources?
Hi, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on soft war and where this all fits in with that from a military point of view.
Maybe just to provide some context, soft war. This is the toin. Thinking about it, like sort of in the context of Jason Lowery's kind of work, which, by the way, his book is also available for sale. I think it's around $200 on Amazon. But maybe you guys can save up for it. If we get the SBR, we might be able to sell a little bit and then afford it ourselves.
All right.
That's the benefit to the American people. If we do an SBR, everyone can afford a copy of Soft War.
I have no polite way to say this, so I'll just say it. Lowry is a complete clown, and his thesis is a combination of incoherent gibberish and just repeating very obvious things that we were talking about back in like 2013. Like if Bitcoin gets big, nation states will get involved in mining. I don't even know how to respond to that question.
If my government just keeps printing money, doesn't that make the food prices go higher? Does that really help the American citizen if they just continue printing the money?
Does having a bridge get, smashed to pieces by a ship that everyone forgot about already 6 months ago, just sitting there not getting fixed?
No,
do
it,
good for the American
it doesn't.
people?
But I don't know if just printing money is the answer either. I don't think there's a right
paying
answer
people
to
to replace the bridge is kind of what fixes
Gotta
things.
figure something out.
All right, guys, let's focus on the SBR. Come on, rein it in.
Should we? It looks like we're coming up to almost 8 o'clock.
All right, they're not going
Should
to
we
kick us
bring-
out for another 10 minutes, so let's get last round of questions.
This might be
in.
quick. So just back to the SBR. So isn't it a signal to the world that we don't have our fiscal house in order?
I think it depends on this. I think it depends entirely on the scale. And I'm not going to sort of be so vain as to think I know what the number is, but I think it's certainly the case that there is both an amount of Bitcoin that the U.S. government could buy, which would be viewed by sort of international, the central bank managers of the largest holders of U.S. treasuries, as just negligible and like sort of Trump political posturing, signaling, whatever. And then I think it's also fair that there is an amount of Bitcoin that the government could buy where you wake up, you're the central bank manager of Japan, and you're like, holy fuck, those Americans are going to rug us, just like they did with Bretton Woods to Europe. So I don't think that by matter of logical necessity that an SBR, even in the tune of billions of dollars, would trigger that. But I would agree with you that there is certainly a point at, I think, my view and BPI's view on this is that, there is a point at which this could be deleterious to global demand for the U.S. Treasury security, but that something in the there is a point at which this could be deleterious to global demand for the U.S. Treasury security.
No, that's not it. The point of Bitcoin is that no one can print the money. So the government could adopt it, but they can't print more of it. There's no way for them to control the money supply. That's the main point.
They'll have to bend the knee to Bitcoin.
Yeah. That's the better way to look at it.
Well, I guess we're talking about sort of monopoly privileges over, like seigniorage versus, sort of separating money and state. To Hoddle's point, I guess would be more about like money production and whether or not the state has a monopoly on it. But no, I think the point is super fair, and like there's definitely a point at which because it's just all a sort of perception game, right? Like, the truth is like there's no way to know. But I highly doubt that like $1 billion of Bitcoin would convince anybody that we're about to. Yeah, and like I think that Luke Groman would probably be a great person to sort of talk to about this. So would like Lynn Alden, but that would just be my answer as honestly as I could tell you. Is like there's a level at which people just wouldn't care and or they'd raise an eyebrow, and there's probably a level at which people would think, yeah, exactly what you said.
You're talking a lot about the nation state. What do you think about individual states starting their own SBR? I know there's been a lot of like Texas and Florida and other places.
Look, I think my meta take on all of this is that it is prudent to own Bitcoin. And that is true no matter who or what you are. And for the same reason that I think probably most people in this room own some Bitcoin, I think nation states will come to see value in doing it as well. So like again, not, like a lot of this just feels like sort of King Lear, just like sort of like yelling at the storm. Like I don't know, it's logical to buy Bitcoin. The government will buy Bitcoin for the same reasons that I did, the same reasons that you did. Maybe not the same reasons that Shinobi did, but like they will buy Bitcoin for their own reasons. Because I think that it is logical and prudent to own Bitcoin. And I think there's like, not that this conversation is entirely like meaningless, but and because I do think the stuff that Shinobi's talking about regarding ossification, I think is right, and I happen to agree with him. But I also don't think that we get to decide whether or not it's prudent for nation states to buy Bitcoin. I think it is just, in fact, prudent for nation states or human beings or hedge funds or pension funds or what have you to own some Bitcoin. So again, like to me, the sort of operative question, and that what we actually do have control over to a slightly greater extent, is whether that sort of nation-state institutional phase of adoption that we're experiencing takes place in a context in which America has a large Bitcoin position relative to its adversaries, such that every tick up in price means a relative win for us and a relative loss for our nation's adversaries, or whether that monetization of Bitcoin takes place in a world where the opposite occurs, that every tick up in the price of Bitcoin, sort of relatively rebalances us downward and our adversaries like upward. So I mean, my take on the SBR is certainly informed by this sort of context of like relative inevitability. Like I just think countries will buy Bitcoin, and the question is just, should we be the first, or should we not? Or, not the first, but should we be the first superpower to buy Bitcoin or not? And I think if that's the setup, the answer to me is like fairly obvious that it should be us. And I think you can believe that, frankly, at the same time as you like accept every argument that Shinobi has made on stage. Like, to be fair, like none of those are mutually exclusive claims.
All right, I think we're just about out of time. So in the few minutes that we have left, why don't I ask each of you to give us a 30-second elevator pitch? Why should we be for or against the SBR? Give us one last parting thought. Shinobi, go for it.
Well, it's just a lot of existential risks and problems and new roadblocks that it has the potential to put in front of Bitcoin being a tool to actually spread freedom, to actually spread an open access, censorship resistant like financial system. And the benefits of opening all those doors and taking on those risks that it could provide to America, I think, are just insignificantly small compared to the global and the benefits for America that ensuring Bitcoin becomes and stays that censorship resistant system. Like it's just the risk reward is not lined up in favor of an SBR in my mind.
David?
I think that Bitcoin fundamentally aligns incentives. And I think that if the United States government has a position in Bitcoin that is larger than its current one, that it is on the margins less incentivized to screw over developers, miners, software providers, and holders of Bitcoin, that it is less likely to 6102 people's Bitcoin in the event of a rapid monetization of the asset if it already has, a bag that it deems sufficiently large. I think that, again, like I don't know how else to reframe this. Whether or not America buys, starts a strategic Bitcoin reserve, I think other countries, including superpowers, will. And I think it's better for America, Americans, and Bitcoiners globally if America is, of the superpowers, the first to the punch.
I think you have to answer your own question. 30-second elevator pitch for why or why not the U.S. government should...
No, the U.S. government should not have an SBR. I should have all the coins. That's my answer. It should be your answer as well. Anyone else having coins is bad. You having coins is good. That's how Bitcoin works.
So true, King.
Good night.
All right. Woo!
Should not have an SBR. I should have all the coins. That's my answer. It should be your answer as well.